bunch of other questions, but I'm going to ask the two questions that the panel was prepared for. I just think that's fairer.
I didn't look at my
Oh, okay. Okay. I suspect you are really prepared regardless. So, in your packet, I do think if we have a chance, I will ask the second question in a different kind of way. But maybe I'll figure out how to do it as part of the first question. Recently, E.D. Hirsch wrote in a HuffPost piece, or concluded in a HuffPost piece, and I suspect many of you have seen it or was in your packet, right? Maybe it was only in my packet. But in this HuffPost piece, what he concluded was that the value-added measures based on ELA exams of reading comprehension were quite volatile and unstable, as Linda has just said. His conclusion was because the exams necessarily tested not just what a child learned in that particular year, assuming the tests were reliable for that purpose, but they also tested or presumed a student's background. So he actually added, in a different way, a factor that Linda was talking about in terms of equity, but saying it differently. So his conclusion was that they just shouldn't be used in teacher evaluations. And so he got to the conclusion that it should have, 0% weight in terms of teacher evaluations. But I think the question I'm really trying to ask here is that not simply do you agree or disagree with what Hirsch has said. I mean, I think we can predict what the answers would be around the table. But I think what it actually raises is, in some ways, the sharp contrast here between using this data in an aggregate way versus using it individually. And I think that's really where Hirsch was going and where the panel was, where you see a difference in terms of the panel. That regardless of what this data may say in an aggregate about either a school or a school system, the question really becomes, is it reliable or accurate enough, given everything that's going on, to use it individually and to be consequential individually?
So I think, to boil it down, I think he's kind of wrong on a lot of the details, but possibly has a legitimate point to make about high-stakes testing. I don't even think his point is as much about teacher value added is it about high-stakes testing per se. 'Cause a lot of the arguments he's making would also apply to what we were doing 5 years ago, before Race to the Top and all this came in. It would apply to No Child Left Behind. It's not like teachers weren't teaching to the test before the value-added measures came into being. So in that respect, I think the argument is a little bit different than the argument I think he's really trying to make is different than the one he sort of stated. On the point about reading being different and families playing a bigger role in reading, I think that's probably right, but I think he's also missing the point that part of the point of value added and the way in which we approach it is to try to take into account some of those factors, not just by measuring family background in some ways, but also by taking into account prior achievement. That's really the most important thing we do to account for the background of the student. So I think he's new to this debate about value added, and I think there are probably a lot of things in the details that I would disagree with him on. But even though a lot of the larger criticisms are valid, and I think we do need to be really concerned, as I think I highlighted in my slides, this problem of teaching to the test and rapidly expanding testing to all grades and subjects and things like that I think are really bad approaches.
So I actually 100% agree with the idea that particularly in literacy, we need to improve the assessments. I think that's one of the findings from the Met study, was that the assessment that is based on what the current state ELA tests are now, which is kids read a short reading passage and then answer some multiple choice questions of reading comprehension, are not as correlated with other measures of instructional excellence, like a classroom observation, as assessments that require kids to do some writing. Now, I was reading E.D. Hirsch's commentary really carefully, and I'm not sure, though, he would agree that it's good enough to try to include some more writing in the measures of literacy. I think actually his central point is that we should be designing tests that focus on curriculum content, not just general reading ability and writing ability. He's saying, look, if we're going to teach U.S. history, we should have a written test that focuses on the content of U.S. history. If we're going to teach, science, we should have a written test that focuses on the content of science. Now, I think if you did have a measure like that, I read his essay as arguing that that's what we should be holding people accountable for. So, ironically, I think one could take his essay and argue for a very different kind of assessment scheme that would be very high stakes. His main point is we don't have that curriculum yet. Now, the question is, we could have a debate about, all right, okay, so we don't have a national curriculum in history. We don't have a national curriculum in social science and sciences. And I'm not sure when and if we ever would have one. So that's the core issue in E.D. Hirsch's essay. But I think around the point of, are the current state ELA tests optimal? I think no. Could they be improved? I think yes. E.D. Hirsch might disagree with that. But as I said before, I don't think that there's evidence to argue that, therefore, we should attach zero weight to the gains on the state ELA test, because those are related to teachers' future gains on those state ELA tests. They are related to what we say is excellent instruction based on classroom observations. Yes, they should be improved, but arguing that they should have no weight, I don't think that, I disagree with, and in fact, I don't think there is the evidence to support that.
So I'd like to just make a couple of points. First, on the general point that Tom was making earlier about the nature of the test, and then I want to say something about E.D. Hirsch's take on this. We have two problems, or three, around the nature of the test, maybe more than those, but that are innumerable. Tests like the SAT-9 that Tom was just talking about and that we saw some statistics about are preferable in a couple of ways, although they don't reach the problem that E.D. Hirsch is talking about. One is that they do require some writing and some thinking, a little bit more analysis, and we do see that teachers who do well on state accountability tests are not always the same as those who show higher value added on tests like the SAT-9. Dallas has done that analysis in their value added work for years. The other thing about the SAT-9, and I miss it, frankly, not that I was ever in love with it when we used it in California, but it actually measures on a vertical scale across multiple grade levels. So the level of value-added growth that a teacher might produce or that occurs for a student, regardless of how many teachers are involved in producing it or how many other factors, can be displayed much more accurately and fully than in any grade level test, which says it will only measure the standards at that grade level. And one of the issues that is on the table is that we have a federal policy that, because it was made by people who did not understand assessment or learning or teaching, requires only grade level testing and state tests, and now a policy that was made by people who also failed to understand those factors must be used to measure value-added gains for teachers when it cannot be so used. And so there's a federal policy change that has to be made if we actually want to get closer to being able to look at value-added gains on any continuum, because we're now putting almost all the weight, not on value-added measures, plural, with multiple opportunities for measuring what kids learn, but on a single measure that is probably the most limited measure we could have. But that's actually not the point E.D. Hirsch was making. He was making the point that reading is actually a function of understanding content. Social studies, history, science, the arts, all of the content that we learn. And that, we really need to be teaching that content and making it possible for kids to acquire it. And one of the other counterproductive effects of focusing in only on reading and math scores in the NCLB era was that we actually reduced the amount of science we were teaching in schools, the amount of history and social studies, making it harder for kids who rely primarily on school to get access to that knowledge, to get the base on which reading comprehension depends, because reading comprehension is actually a content-rich activity. So he makes the point that in the test prep time that is being generated by current policies is time in which teachers should calmly be pursuing real education, teaching students fascinating subjects in literature, history, civics, science, and the arts, the general knowledge that is the true foundation of reading comprehension. And he's very nice. He says the villains in this story are not the well-meaning economists who developed the value-added idea, but the inadequate theories of reading comprehension that have dominated the schools and, for that matter, the tests. So I think that's another aspect of why, while we're trying to get a hold of this idea that teaching really does matter for learning, and we want to understand how it matters, that we have to broaden the set of measures that we use and get a basket of evidence that allows us to support the kind of learning that kids need and the more accurate measures that are useful for guiding teaching.
So that leads me to the second question, which the piece of the first question that I don't think any of you answered, then I'm going to just ask the audience if they want the answer. I'll ask you if you want to re-ask the question, which is this notion of the aggregate use of this data versus individual use of that data. And I think that that is a question that really kind of came from a lot of the different presentations. That's really the sharp difference between a lot of the different presentations. But I'm just going to keep it out there to see if others are interested in that. I think that this notion, though, that both Tom and Linda raised at the end of their answer about does teaching matter raises my second, goes to my second question, which is, if we assume that teaching does matter, then, and that teaching of the Common Core, let me ask it this way, if we assume that teaching does matter, and that the Common Core standards are some template for what kids need to know and be able to do in the 21st century, at least, regardless of whether one thinks that they were prodded or promoted by Race to the Top, 45 states still have adopted them, whether or not they are funding them or whether or not other things are happening, they still have adopted them. But if we think that's really, really, really important, let me ask you if you agree with the call I made about a moratorium on the consequences of high-stakes testing, and whether that moratorium would be beneficial to actually doing the kind of preparation that we think is actually needed to implement the Common Core with fidelity, and whether or not it's the moratorium The more important question is, do we need to have a real transition that actually is much more about what we're doing in classrooms right now and less about what is being tested? And so whether it's the moratorium idea that we raised in the end of April, or whether, for example, it's the new idea that is emanating out of California that was passed by the California legislature, I think the Senate just last night, and that the governor has said that he will sign, and that Arnie Duncan has said that he will deny, about essentially having a year of a piloting of the Smarter Balance test without revealing any of the results, so that it's really the kind of piloting of the whole process, and at the same time not having the old tests. So the bottom line question is, do you agree that there should really be a transitional period of time or not that is decoupled from either the high-stakes consequences of the tests or the testing itself to enable Common Core to be implemented?
So I think it's, on technical grounds, I think it's hard to answer that question. So I think it's substantial. In some ways, I think it's a political question. But let me explain why I think it's hard to answer on technical grounds. So the first point is that the tests are not the same every year anyway, right? Even when we're not changing the testing regime. So what's different about the Common Core is that you're changing the test and you're changing the curriculum at the same time. So it's a much more major change than most states would typically make. But I think we don't know a lot, and I think part of what Tom's presentation earlier was trying to get at is what happens to the properties of value-added measures once you change the test. And I think what it's suggesting, although that was the first I've seen of that, is that it doesn't change the patterns very much. But it is almost certain to change what the results would be for particular teachers, right? So a teacher who, if they had kept the test a certain way, kept it the way it is without the switch, would be rated differently. And most teachers will be rated differently, and some perhaps substantially differently. Part of it will depend on how the school implements the curriculum, how much the school's already shifted, because some states and some districts have already made a pretty full shift. And some haven't even tried. So the teachers in districts that haven't even begun that shift are going to be at a pretty big disadvantage. And just one example of how that's going to vary, how it influences teachers will vary across places. So I think whether it's going to be any more or less accurate is hard to say. There are ways in which it could become more accurate. If it's a better test in states where the test is, the current test is not a very good one, then in some ways it could end up being, the value-added measures could get better. But I think overall, obviously it's a transition period, and there's more of a political element here. Do we want to kind of recognize the fears of teachers and focus on the implementation of Common Core and get that right first before we worry about the test-based accountability? The flip side is going to be, for those who want to keep the accountability, is, well, is this just a slippery slope, and is this just going to mean that maybe we'll never go back to where we were, and this is just sort of a first step towards that? So I think a lot of it comes down to these partly political decisions and partly issues of more around implementation of Common Core than it is about whether it's valid to use teacher value-added measures when we've made a shift like this.
So I think we could have a reasonable discussion of whether or not it makes sense to have a moratorium on the high stakes on the value-added scores during a transition year. But I just wanted to clarify, that's not what's happening in California. What's happening in California is particularly irrational and absurd, I'll have to say. It's not put this way, but this is what it is. It is, we're going to test 3.3 million children in California and not score it.
Is it not scored or not share the scores?
It's not score most of them. They're going to score a subset of the pilot. Now, if I were, what is the argument for that, as opposed to just saying, look, we're not going to test it all in spring of 2014? if the argument, so here's an argument for a moratorium that I think makes sense, that says, hey, look, we're shifting to new standards. We need to help teachers figure out how to teach to these new standards. So if we have a year in which the tests are not used for high stakes, that might ease that transition. I don't see how we're going to help teachers teach these new standards if we don't tell them how their kids did. I don't see how, in any way, that could prove to be useful. If we're not even going to tell them, after they've spent a year trying to teach the new standards, whether or not their children have achieved the standards or not. That seems particularly irrational. So now, the evidence I reported before was that actually, honestly, was a bit of a surprise to me. I would have thought, based on what we found in MET, that when New York State moved from their old test to a test that was more aligned with the Common Core, I would have expected that correlation, which I showed went from 0.51 to 0.46, I would have predicted it would have gone down more. I would have predicted it would have gone down from 0.51 to 0.3 or 0.25. I'd still argue that that the old tests still provide information, but I would have predicted in that year it wouldn't have been as much. Now, just to clarify what Doug's point earlier was that, okay, when we move from one test to another, you'd expect a teacher's results to change. What I reported says, okay, yes, lots of people's results changed, but no more than usually did even when they kept the same test. So the correlation was about the same, 0.51 to 0.46. So things changed. Yes, the measures are not perfect. But again, so remember, here's one piece of this argument that I think many people forget. They sort of think in the back of their minds that there is such a thing as a no-stakes decision. That somehow, if the evidence isn't perfect, we should hold. But there is, in certain kinds of decisions, there is no such thing as a low-stakes decision. So under most collective bargaining agreements, after 2 years, a teacher gets tenure the third year. A principal is making a decision not about one teacher. A principal is making a decision about two teachers. There are two teachers involved in every tenure decision. One is the teacher that has been there in that school for 2 years. The other is the potential other novice teacher who would love to have that job. And we are asking supervisors to make a hard decision involving two different teachers. The teacher that they know, whose birthday party they've been to, and maybe whose children's pictures they've seen, and the teacher that they maybe have never met before. And to argue that if somebody has a poor track record, that somehow we should deny that slot to the young teacher who's applied for that job, I think is pretending that there is such a thing as a no-stakes decision, and is ignoring the costs borne by the students and borne by the teacher who's being overlooked.
Tom, I don't think that was, before Linda goes, with all due respect, I don't think that was the question. I think the real issue becomes not whether there should be teacher evaluations and whether that should be, and the stakes associated with that. I think the real question becomes, just in this transitional period of time, the issue about the moratorium, that's number one.
Right.
And the other real question becomes, is this actually, with a 50% shot of getting it right or getting it wrong, is it actually really a measure of student learning? I think that the those are really the questions
Right.
here.
So-
And
so
I don't mean to be,
Right. I
you know.
didn't draw the, I
Okay.
realized I didn't draw the connection clearly enough. What
Okay.
I was saying was, over that threshold, if it turned out that a teacher's student achievement gains on the old tests told you nothing about their student achievement gains on the new tests, I would agree with you that, hey, look, there definitely should be a moratorium. Because what that says is we've got no information based on that old test about how that teacher's students will do following the adoption of the new test. But what we know is actually that's not the case. What we know is that, say if there's that teacher who's up for tenure during that threshold year, do we know anything about how well his or her students will do the year after they get tenure when they switch to the new test? The answer is yes, we do. And I would argue it would be a mistake to throw that information away.
Linda.
I'm trying to decide whether to answer your question or respond to Tom, but I'm going to try to answer your question. I just have to say, though, that the correlations are not the real issue. I mean, when you go from a 0.51 to a 0.46, so in the first case, your score on that first value-added metric predicts 25% of the variance in your score. On the second one, it drops to 20% of the variance predicted. That still leaves a huge amount of the variance not predicted, and you don't know which is right. And even when a teacher has a score that correlates from one year to the other on whatever the metrics are, what we know about the errors in the current system, particularly for teachers teaching kids at the tails of the distribution, is that if you teach gifted classes year after year after year, the AP kids, you're going to have low value added on certain measures, and that's going to correlate from year to year perhaps, but that doesn't mean you're a bad teacher. So we have to keep coming back to the meaning of the scores and not just the correlations, and whether they're modest or, less than modest, and that's really what we're talking about there. With respect to the moratorium question, and that's, by the way, I do think that there are value-added measures that can be helpful to us, but I think we've got to get closer to the ones that are the most meaningful. And that's the conversation I think we should be having, the one that's educational in its substance. With respect to the moratorium, I think it's very sound that we should be getting a moment where people, when countries introduce new curriculum standards, curriculum and tests, as they do in many countries, that we're now trying to emulate with the Common Core, it's a 5 to 7 year period in which they introduce standards, they develop curriculum resources, they do professional development for teachers, they build the assessments to measure those, and so on. And so there should be a process by which we help people learn how to do this work if we want to understand the outcomes of the work that they've been doing. They've been teaching to different standards, they've been teaching to different tests, the curriculum materials have not yet arrived, the professional development is still on the way, and the assessments are being field tested this year. They're not even actually done. They're not supposed to be done until 2014-15. So does it make sense to have a moratorium? I would say absolutely on high stakes. I don't think we should have a moratorium on the assessments because people need to see them and get used to them and learn about them and begin to incorporate that into their practice. But we shouldn't be punishing people, kids or teachers, based on the results of those tests. I would go further. I would say it's time to move from the test and punish accountability schema of No Child Left Behind to an assess and improve schema of a new accountability system. And really we need to rethink, we're going to pour this new wine, which could be very good wine, and now I'm going into my California space.
What do you call it? Test and punish to improve and what?
And assess and improve. I live close to Napa Valley, so I have to go there. This new wine into old bottles, and it's going to turn sour. When you talk to teachers about the Common Core and they read the Common Core initially, typically they're very excited about the vision of learning, the vision of career and college readiness that's embedded in this. And they think about all the great things they could do in their classroom to measure that. But that excitement often turns to fear and dread, because they're fearful that we'll be back in the old test and punish modality, that this is going to be used, there won't be time to get it right, and it'll be used to deny kids promotion to the next grade or diplomas or teachers, a fair evaluation, or schools the opportunity to exist and have a multiple measures approach. So I think if we move to a new accountability system where we're doing what other high-achieving countries do, what the Finns call intelligent accountability, which is using the results to evaluate what's working, to set in place, improvements that can make them better, curriculum development, professional development, and so on, where people can really focus on the kind of teaching that Edie Hirsch was talking about. And we can use tests for good rather than being constrained by the misuse of tests. We will be in a much better educational position at the end of this next decade than we are today.
Yes,
Just
absolutely.
clarifying question. So,
and I am actually, the reason I look like I'm being rude here is I'm actually seeing if there's any Twitter, since this is being live streamed, if there's any Twitter questions as including the questions in the audience.
oh, I thought that was you texting me.
As I was texting you, love that stuff.
Linda, I'm trying to clarify your position a little bit. Are you saying more that you're in a number 2 position, the way I had described it, that you don't think value-added measures should be used in high-stakes decision, and that the basket is being used more for support and information through a more subjective decision-making process that the principals might use or that a district might use? Or are you saying something more like the number 3 or 4 position, where we're still using it as high stakes, but a more comprehensive set of measures? I'm just not quite sure where it's coming down.
Well, there's several things on the table here. Yeah. One is school accountability, one is teacher accountability, and one is student accountability. And the call for a moratorium, I think, was on all of those. That is, let's not use these tests before we've figured out how to do the teaching for any of those purposes. With respect to the individual teacher evaluation question, which I think you're asking me to return to, I really believe that we need not only whatever these new tests will tell us about students' achievement of the Common Core standards, and I will tell you I'm deeply disappointed that the way that the management of the process has occurred, we will still be stuck in grade level standards, and that's going to really make it hard to say anything about whether kids below grade level are making progress and whether kids above grade level are making progress, which is most kids, by the way. It's not, it's not a minority of the kids. But I do think that they can be helpful once we figure out what they're doing and what they can tell us, supplemented by other measures, which help us get at the things they don't evaluate. So if I were trying to put myself on your 1 to 5 scale, I think I would be arguing for multiple measures which can be used in a value-added sense. And I think there are other measures that are better for value-added.
But used for high-stakes employment decisions, used for tenure, used for compensation,
used
and so
as part of the holistic determination of a teacher's ability to continue their employment or to be tenured or whatever. I actually don't know that it, I don't think any single measure should be used, and as you know, I'm particularly disenchanted with the state test as a psychometric tool in this regard. And if I haven't made that clear, let me say it again. Because there are so many better measures. I mean, if I were an elementary school principal, I'd say I want to look at the developmental reading assessment, which actually has a scale and measures things more fully and more comprehensively and points teaching in the right direction and gives me a sense of which kids are making progress and which teachers are helping the kids make progress. But I think that the extent to which there will be useful tools for different teachers will vary, as your point suggested also. And I like the idea of diagnostics and screening using more than one measure. And I would say for most teachers there are 2 or 3 measures that ought to be in a basket that you could look at based on what's appropriate for evaluating the gains they're making with their students.